It has been 10 years since an 8-magnitude earthquake struck Wenchuan in southwestern Sichuan province on May the 12th, 2008. It left more than 80,000 fatalities or missing people. The impact of the devastating earthquake on disaster prevention, relief and rescue efforts was huge. To raise public awareness, the Chinese government has set this date as Disaster Prevention and Reduction Day, as the capacity for international cooperation in disaster relief has improved. But what is the latest in the earthquake-hit region in Sichuan? What does this decade-old devastating earthquake mean for China today? And how do we memorialize that event and build better living conditions for future generations? To talk about these and more, I'm happy to be joined by Professor Jamie Flocruz from Peking University and also Mr. Gregory Yinyan-Zhang, our current affairs commentator. And also we'll be talking to Taoyuan, our own reporter in Sichuan, by satellite. And that is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue.
A symbol of every clock that stopped at the exact moment, 2:28. Tens of thousands of lives as well stopped on that fateful afternoon 10 years ago. Dai Guohong almost didn't make it. Instead, he lost his legs.
My school building collapsed right away. The floor underneath us cracked. My legs fell into the crack. The floor then closed. My legs were trapped. There were aftershocks, and the floor squeezed tighter and tighter. I passed out from the pain. And then the next aftershock, another pain would wake me. I wish for the aftershocks to come stronger. I wish to die.
When rescue teams finally pulled Guohong out 2 days later, he had two choices. He was going to lose his legs or his life. Prosthetics and wheelchair were what the future had in store. But to the surprise of even himself, he found a second life in water, swimming at first to help with recovery, then going on to win 9 national champions and breaking a national record in 100-meter breaststroke.
The whole time I just wanted to prove myself, to prove that I can still do so many things without my legs.
10 years on, Guohong says his wounds have healed, physically and psychologically, an example of the resilience of those who lost so much in the earthquake. But Guohong doesn't want to be seen that way.
I'm naturally optimistic, but I don't represent everyone. I think it wouldn't be fair to think everyone is now okay. In fact, 90% of the people I know are still struggling to deal with the past.
Psychologists would agree. Chen Heqiong, another survivor, has counseled students over the past decade.
Without professional help, I don't think many people will be able to recover from a disaster of this scale.
Chen has her own scars. 10 years ago, she was buried under the rubble for 3 days without food or water. Since then, she's been afraid of the dark, and on every anniversary, she still feels pain remembering the friends she's lost. But Chen has learned not to dwell on it.
I think what's important is to live in the moment. That's how you find yourself.
Guohong and Chen count themselves lucky because they were able to escape the shadow of the devastating disaster. But they admit many other people can't. And they say that what's important for people in this region is learn to move on, even as the scars remain. Taoyuan, CGTN, Wenchuan.
So 10 years ago, on May the 12th, 2008, a magnitude 8 earthquake hit Wenchuan in southwest China's Sichuan province, bringing huge casualties and losses to the local people. There must be some progress happening. There are also important stories that happened that we can share today. And for that, let's turn to our reporter Taoyuan, who has been covering this from Yingxiu in Sichuan province. And Taoyuan, I know it's not the first time you went there. What is your recollections of that disaster 10 years ago?
Well, Doya, this is the 10th anniversary, so it is a special occasion. Everywhere you go, every person you talk to here in Wenchuan, you hear stories about the earthquake. Where I am right now is the earthquake's memorial site in Yingxiu Township, which was the epicenter of the 2008 earthquake. You can see behind me is what used to be a middle school called Xuankou. The ruins are kept to remember the devastating disaster. You can also see this clock behind me is pointing at 2:28. That's the exact moment when the earthquake struck. Many clocks on that day were found to have stopped at that exact moment. So 2:28, that's when afternoon class had just begun in this school. 55 students and teachers in this school alone lost their lives on that fateful afternoon. The bodies of some 20 people were never retrieved and are still buried underneath the debris. And that's because the tremor cut off the roads. So rescue teams only reached this township 2 days after the earthquake. By the time they started retrieving the bodies, many had already decomposed, and some of the parents just couldn't bear seeing their children in that condition, and so they begged rescue workers to stop digging. So the past couple of days when we were here, we've seen many people from in and out of this region coming to this site to pay their respect to those who lost their lives 10 years ago. And on the 10th anniversary, the memories are indeed resurfacing. So yeah.
And the city itself, and actually the whole area, has been undergoing reconstruction. How would you describe the earthquake-hit region right now?
Yes, so having said everything I said before about the scars, about the wounds, I think another storyline here in Wenchuan is the wonderful resilience of the people and their courage to rebuild their homeland and their lives. The central government and Wenchuan's sister cities have also poured huge amounts of money and resources into the reconstruction process. So the houses and the streets are just beautiful, especially from a bird's eye point of view, from villages on those mountain tops. Many of the schools in this region are built to withstand magnitude 9 earthquakes. So actually physical rebuilding, physical reconstruction has long been completed. But now the region is undergoing, I think, what could be seen as a second phase of reconstruction, and that is to improve its ecosystem and its economic structure. So before the earthquake, Wenchuan was a county that relied heavily on heavy industries. In the past 10 years, the people here have been gradually closing down and phasing out heavy industries in factories, developing agriculture, cash crop cultivation, and clean industries. People told us that the disaster has made them think about how to live their lives, and now they respect life more and they respect their living environment more. As for the challenges, I think it's the same challenges that any transforming economy would have to go through. I mean, the old model has already gone, but the new hasn't been fully established yet. But I think the local people here, they also understand that this is for the long-term benefit of the region and the people here.
And you mentioned the resilience of the local people. How did that devastating and traumatizing experience reshape their memory of earlier lives and also their outlook for the future?
Well, so I think living standard-wise, I think there's no doubt that the situation here in Yingxiu and in other counties and townships affected in the 2008 earthquake, I think there's no doubt the economy, the infrastructure, the standard of living, all of those things have improved by leaps and bounds. But many people I spoke with they're genuinely happy about the changes, but I also want to quote an interview subject of mine. He's a young man whom I spoke with a couple of days ago. He lost both his legs in the earthquake, but then he went on to become an amputee swimmer, an inspirational speaker. He actually told me that many people who were affected by the earthquake feel that the 10th anniversary should be some kind of a closure for those who experienced the terrible disaster. This is when they're going to put the past behind them, and for the rest of the world, this may be a time when people start to forget about the Wenchuan earthquake. And he told told me that he thinks this is good and bad because, well, on one hand, people need to move on, right? But for many who experience the devastating earthquake, it won't be that easy. He said he counts himself one of the lucky few people who has escaped the shadows of the hollowing experience, but he said many people he came into contact with as an inspirational speaker has not been able to walk out of the shadows, and they're still carrying a scar, and some people are indeed dealing with rather severe psychological issues. So I think even as the actual physical reconstruction of the county, of the township, is completed, the mental reconstruction is by far not over. And many people I spoke with said it might be impossible to ever make sense of their loss, but they said what's important is try and move on even as the scars remain. So yeah.
Wow, the sense of loss is still there. Thank you so much, Tao Yuan, for your reporting from Yingxiu in Sichuan province. Let's come back to our studio discussions. Jamie, 10 years ago, that was a huge event for China, not only for the local people, because back then 80,000 people perished in that natural disaster, and China was preparing for the Olympics back then. It was a roller coaster ride of psychology for many Chinese.
It was a big shock, I think, for many Chinese. It was a big news and big shock for the foreign media like ours. So when it happened, we immediately sent teams, reporting teams, to the site. A very difficult story to cover physically, but also emotionally. I think our reporting team saw a lot of stories of heroism, of suffering, of course, and pain. Many people perished, but we also saw a lot of stories, inspiring stories of people's resilience, but also people helping each other, and that was really memorable.
You've been covering in China for a long time. How would you describe the coverage of that particular natural disaster? Because it's not the first time China suffered a big earthquake.
Correct. I was also here for the 1976 Tangshan earthquake. Marked difference in terms of how quickly I think the Chinese media and later the foreign media were able to go over, in spite of the logistical difficulties of covering it. So I thought the coverage was extensive. It was also empathetic. It was so easy to be sympathetic to what you see around you. You know, seeing a middle school that had collapsed. Seeing rubbles, kids, a soccer ball or sneakers buried under the rubble, and you don't even have to see bodies. You just have memories of people who perished.
Gregory, what is your memory of that?
Actually, at that time when it happened, I was called upon to come to the station to make comments afterwards. I think one of the greatest tragedies happened during that time was a parish of almost 9,000 students, out of 80,000 destroyed, including 6,000 classrooms destroyed, and buried 9,000 students. They found out those buildings, school buildings, were the least prepared to be structured in the right way. They were brick buildings. They were built not according to safety rules regulations. When the earthquake struck in the afternoon at 2:30 or so, students were in the classroom. So when the building went down, from the top to the bottom, flat, with all the young lives destroyed at the same time, that was a great tragedy indeed.
And a lot of people are reflecting on that, why there is such a huge casualty of young students. Do you blame the construction codes of some of the schoolhouses in that part of China, or it is a perfect storm of everything because it happened in the afternoon where everybody is inside? There are a lot of young students in that part of the area pursuing their studies.
Of course, when the earthquake struck in that area, all the buildings in that territory were affected to some extent. However, many government buildings stood strong, survived. Almost all these classrooms went down flat, so there's a problem. And of course, I think China learned from the experience. Afterwards, decided to make sure those constructions would follow the rule, be able to sustain the shock to some extent. So that's a good learning from that bad experience. But to begin with, why it happened? It shouldn't happen that way at all. Perhaps, who knows, maybe the school administrators, when those buildings are built, they have certain things under the table, so to speak. But at long last, when things change to the better, that's what it counts.
And Jamie, how do you evaluate the relief work and the crisis management of the Chinese government and of the civil society, of course?
Looking back, I thought it was prompt and efficient and comprehensive in general. I mean, we can nitpick on details, but in general, when I went there a few days later, I could tell that the government was in control. China has many advantages when it comes to disaster relief and quick response. The top-down nature of the agencies as they are organized. You have the civil affairs, and most important, the Chinese military is the best organized for quick response like this. China also has Red Cross volunteers who I think all of those helped in and having a quick response, effective response. When I was there, also part of the response is, how to prevent secondary destruction, aftershocks. So you have to move millions of people out of dangerous places, dangerous buildings right away. You also need to prevent epidemics, health risks. And I think China is very good at that, very good at mobilizing people, of moving them from one place to another, and then tapping on the various agencies and the resources that they have.
Because unavoidably, many people would compare different governments' response to natural disasters. For example, when Hurricane Katrina hit the U.S., people blame the federal government for not responding quickly. But how do you see the Chinese system? We say, 集中力量办大事. We can mobilize resources at a short notice and have a great efficiency to respond to any kind of emergency. Is this the advantage of China's system?
I think it is. In many ways, it has its disadvantages, but in cases of natural disasters, of emergencies like this, China has an advantage of being able to quickly mobilize resources, mobilize people, use the military to quickly send, deploy hundreds of thousands of army men and volunteers. Because you don't have time. Time is of the essence, and that's an advantage.
But it is also a test of the government, because when Premier was in the disaster zone, he had to phone the general and saying, well, you have to be accountable for whatever you are doing because you're not doing enough. It seems the Chinese government is also trying to coordinate and mobilize different resources at a crisis moment.
That's very true. I think Wen Jiabao flew to the epicenter an hour and a half right after the main strike landed to make such gigantic destruction, and then soldiers mobilized, like 13,000 soldiers and so on. So it's good mobility to get the job done. Of course, you cannot depend on the government alone to take care of the issue. You have to be prepared on a regular basis. For example, Japan and Taiwan are the two locations where earthquake, typhoon struck most often. So they have a system, not depending solely on the government organizations, but also they have a civic organizations, they have people-to-people programs to set up. So so to be able to prepare for the event ahead of time. Then when this crisis is happening out of sudden, they are better prepared to save themselves, and also neighborhood mobilization and so on. So I think we should learn from that experience, be able to say this thing is not things to be done only by the government. It requires individual initiative and social network to do the job together.
Get something positive from the negative. We'll be talking more about what should we learn from the natural disaster 10 years ago. You're now watching Dialogue on CGTN. Don't go away, we'll be right back. And actually, to raise people's awareness, Gregory, and on disaster prevention and reduction, the Chinese government designated May the 12th as Disaster Prevention and Reduction Day.
The following year. Yeah.
It is aimed to raise people's awareness to prevent from having bigger impact from natural disasters and be better prepared. But do you think today we are more prepared than 10 years ago in facing huge disasters, natural disasters?
Obviously, China has made tremendous progress since that time, and it's also with good intentions to set this day aside as a sort of a prevention and risk reduction day. However, to set it up is not enough. It's just the beginning. For example, we have Children's Day, we have Mother's Day, we have Father's Day, to highlight the importance of those particular group mentioned, in this case, the earthquake prevention and so on.
What has happened and what needs to happen?
Well, for example, I think they started to make better monitoring system. For example, use satellite and also on-location electronic devices. So there'll be a chance to detect something happening. They also watch the
earthquake early warning system.
Area.
There is a system in place now. If there is a quake happen somewhere, they will relay that information in the nearby region.
However, no matter how advanced those technologies are today, you cannot accurately predict where this will happen all of a sudden anywhere at all. Therefore, these preparations are essential to reduce the possibilities of having a larger damage caused without preparation. So I think this is a good approach. You know.
And Gregory mentioned that the civil society should also empower themselves to prevent natural disasters having more damage. But do you think China has done a good job in that area?
I think China can still encourage even stronger, more active participation by the civil society, the NGOs, including the international NGOs, you know, the UNICEFs and WHOs, for example, can be tapped. But also, I think when we speak of prevention and education, I think you begin with schools, right? I think that can still be improved. You begin with the role of the media, for example. I think the media will play a huge role in terms of educating the people of, you know, on what to do in case of disasters like an earthquake, how to react. Schools can also teach the kids how to react, because these preventive measures can save lives. We do that in the Philippines, where I'm from. There are periodic kind of exercises or mock exercises of different agencies and schools. You know, how do you go under the table, or do you run? In case of earthquake, do you use the elevators?
But the argument is that the Chinese have a strong government and resourceful government. It doesn't leave much room for NGOs to do that kind of work in a cases like that.
And I think that's wrong. I think that we cannot rely solely on the government. There are many things that the government can do, and do it efficiently and quickly. But there are also things that the NGOs can play. For example, trauma. Addressing psychological needs of people in case of disasters. I think that's where the NGOs can play a huge role.
And I agree with this statement. For example, there are things can be done only by the government. For example, to mobilize the military forces, and also to have scientific investigation, preparations, and how to make the relief program going strong. But at the same time, people themselves are very important. If they are really prepared for unexpected events, be able to know how to save themselves. For example, in Japan, a professor from Kyoto University started this idea 2 years ago. They called everyday preparedness. That is, you're ready every day with good spirit, you know, with good intention, ready to move on, facing any unexpected event. So we need Chinese people to empowered with that type of capability, so they can handle themselves better no matter where to go.
And also the NGOs and the volunteers do their work differently than the government. They have more people skills. They
Yes.
tend to comfort each other. For example, the president, President Xi himself, he sent his daughter to the disaster areas together with her mom to do volunteers work. It seems that this is a way to really help people overcome the traumatizing experience.
Yes, because they know each other mostly. I mean, for example, the survivors in Sichuan relied a lot to also survive, or who lived nearby. I remember meeting a middle-aged woman, a survivor of the earthquake in Yingzhou, and she had to move to her relatives in Chengdu. We gave her a ride, and I think that's a very common kind of resource. You rely not just on the government, but also on your family and your neighborhood.
Another thing is that funding and donations are now regulated by agencies, because of the charity work is a very important part of relief and reconstruction. But China's NGOs and charity organizations are not developing as everybody wishes. What is the problem?
Well, I think the problem is transparency. In the way they do their job should be transparent, and there should be some accountability too. Accountable to the public, accountable to the people who donated, for example, and accountable to the government.
So you're referring to the Red Cross scandal several years ago, which hurt the prestige of that organization.
Unfortunately, yes. And I think they need to recover their credibility through actual work, and again, by improving the sense of transparency. They have to do things open and above board. They have to be accountable to the people and to the media. The media also plays a very important role.
Yeah, and the Chinese people are empathetic and sympathetic people. Back then, 10 years ago, a lot of people were making donations. People want to help each other, but institutional building is still far from being perfect in this country, right?
I agree. I think donations are important as a contribution made by the society. At the same time, the government supervision, inspection is also important. Make sure donations are spent at the right place. For example, there should be a follow-up to find out those victim families. Are they really getting the dough? Are they really being helped? Things to be done. Make sure the media play a role in also to voice the opinions. Make sure these things happen at the bottom level can be really publicized and be heard by the people at the top, make decisions as such. So this is again a task cannot be done by government itself. It requires a total consolidation, efficiency to do the job right.
You mentioned several times Japan. Japan obviously is an earthquake-prone country. What are the things we can learn from our neighbor in terms of infrastructure building and also institutional building?
Well, Japan, I understand, 2 years ago lined up with the World Bank to have the seminars conducted, basically to transfer or to share ideas with developing countries how to handle this natural these disasters and hazards. At the same time, Taiwan has also experiences dealing with the issue. So I think I'd like to see the government would spend more time to help the Chinese organizations, the Chinese people responsible for release to have more interaction with the foreign experts, to learn from whatever they have done, which is applicable to China, to use it within China itself.
Okay, all right. And on that optics note, we end today's show. Thank you so much, Jamie, and thank you, Gregory. You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Zoria. Thanks for watching.